let's get straight to the point. Number 10. Ned Ludd. I introduce you to the man who never existed. It is the longest and most expensive running joke in British industrial history. The Luddites were just frustrated workers who went around smashing machinery during the Industrial Revolution. Their leader, Ned Ludd, was about as real as your summer camp girlfriend who conveniently lives in Canada. The origin story says Ned was a weaver so angry he completely lost it one day and destroyed 2 stocking frames in a fit of rage. Not exactly an epic tale, but we move. Of course, no one can find any proof that this man ever existed. The workers who actually smashed the machines were clever. They signed their threats and letters as King Ludd or General Ludd. They would write things like, "From the office of Ned Ludd," acting as if this angry, imaginary weaver had a whole corporate structure running. Some letters even claimed Ned Ludd was hiding in Sherwood Forest, the same Sherwood Forest where Robin Hood supposedly lived. The British government unbelievably fell for it. They spent years trying to locate and arrest this Ned Ludd guy. They couldn't find him for one simple reason. He didn't exist. The myth, however, worked perfectly for the real machine breakers. Whenever they smashed up a factory, they could just blame this mysterious Ned Ludd character. "Oh, that was Ned, you just missed him, sorry." Today, we still use the term Luddite to describe someone who hates new technology. Think about that. You are being compared to followers of an angry imaginary weaver. Congrats.
Number 9. Sir John Mandeville. Imagine the resume. The most famous travel writer of his time, a guy who influenced explorers like Christopher Columbus and whose book was translated into more languages than the Bible itself. Impressive, right? Especially for someone who never existed. Sir John Mandeville was, without a doubt, the greatest catfish of medieval England. This fellow supposedly wrote a travelogue about his 30-year journey across the world, claiming to have seen absolutely everything. He boasted of encountering everything from people with dog heads to trees that yielded small lambs as fruit. It's the medieval equivalent of posting fake vacation photos on Instagram, but with more folklore. A visionary. The book exploded and became a medieval bestseller. The issue is, no one could find any record of this Sir John. 0 birth certificate, 0 family records, nothing. It's as if he was a medieval bot account that somehow wrote a bestseller. Modern historians believe the real author was probably some bookworm rotting away in the library. Instead of actually traveling, he just blatantly copied stories from other books and added his own spicy, wild details for extra engagement. That's like writing a luxury travel blog about Paris using only Google Street View and TripAdvisor reviews. The most hilarious part is that some of his invented stories actually influenced real explorers. Christopher Columbus literally took a copy of Mandeville's book as his guide when he sailed to the Americas. Using a fantasy novel as your GPS, that's exactly what Columbus did. The book also described that the Earth was round and could be circumnavigated, centuries before anyone actually did it. That's like throwing darts blindfolded and somehow, by sheer dumb luck, hitting the bullseye.
Number 8. Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar Lothbrok is, to be fair, the Viking equivalent of a greatest hits album from a boy band. Vikings had a bunch of different leaders who did indeed do incredible things. We had one guy who invaded Paris, another who conquered parts of England, and another who happened to have some legendary sons who became great warriors in their own right. Then, centuries later, along come these storytellers who, in a display of narrative laziness, decide that all these epic accomplishments were done by just one cool guy. And just like that, the super Viking Ragnar Lothbrok was born. In reality, we have very good records of the Viking leaders from that era. We know about Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and other Vikings who were supposedly Ragnar's sons. But when it comes to the big man, silence. Nothing. No contemporary record mentions him, no chronicle talks about him. Even his death story is suspiciously dramatic and over the top. Being thrown into a snake pit by an angry English king, that's not history, that is third-rate Hollywood material. The Vikings themselves probably knew Ragnar wasn't real. These stories were not meant to be taken as historical facts, they were more like Marvel's superhero movies, pure entertainment with a message. The message was clear: look how awesome Vikings are.
Number 7. Prester John. I introduce you to the most powerful king who never existed. He was essentially the original catfish of the Middle Ages.
In 1165, a mysterious and highly suspicious letter showed up in Europe. It was supposedly from Prester John, a Christian king ruling somewhere in a vaguely defined location called the Orient. In the letter, he claimed his kingdom was literally full of gold, his palace was made of crystal, and he had an army of millions waiting to help fight Europe's enemies. To top off the marketing, he also boasted about having a magic mirror that let him see everything happening in his realm and fountains of youth that kept his people eternally young. The letter described a kingdom so obscenely wealthy that even the poorest people were walking around wearing silk. Rivers flowed with gold instead of water. The weirdest part? There were no poor people, no thieves, and no liars in his realm. It must have been a terribly boring place. Unbelievably, the European rulers actually fell for the whole thing. They spent entire centuries trying to find this invented king. The Pope personally sent people out looking for him. Explorers embarked on crazy quests across Asia and Africa, burning resources trying to find his fantasy kingdom. When they couldn't find him in Asia, they decided, well, he must be in Africa then. The classic "the map was wrong" excuse. The legend grew so large that cartographers, unsure where it was, started placing his kingdom on their maps anyway. The story only died out when people actually started exploring these places correctly and reported back, nope, just desert and actual people. Reality always spoils the fun.
Number 6. Romulus and Remus. You know the story of Rome's founders. Two twin brothers raised by a wolf who miraculously went on to build the biggest empire in history. Turns out, that's about as real as my chances of winning the lottery without even buying a ticket. Romulus and Remus were completely invented by the Romans, who desperately needed a cool origin story for their city. It's like Instagram influencers photoshopping their vacation pictures. The only difference is, the Romans were doing the same thing with their history. The plot is ridiculous, yet it has traction. Two twin brothers, abandoned as babies, are rescued and suckled by a she-wolf, because clearly being raised by a normal couple would be too boring. They grow up, decide to build a city, and then, typically, get into a fight over the best location for the development. Romulus, the victor, kills his brother, and just to rub it in, names the city after himself, Rome. Classic. Sibling rivalry, murder, and then you get all the credit. And here's the kicker. The Romans didn't even invent this story until hundreds of years after Rome was supposedly founded. They took random bits and pieces of Greek myths, added some local flavor, and crafted their legendary origin story. This fabricated narrative became so crucial to Roman identity that they started putting it on everything: coins, statues, buildings. The branding was serious. And it worked so well that 2,000 years later, people still think these guys were real. The power of ancient marketing.
Number 5. Sawney Bean, the most famous Scottish cannibal who never existed. Picture this horror movie scene. You are strolling along the Scottish coast in the 1500s. The sun is setting, shadows stretch, and bam! Suddenly, you are attacked by an entire family of cave-dwelling cannibals, led by Alexander Sawney Bean. This dedicated family managed to murder and devour over 1,000 travelers across an impressive 25 years. They were so committed that they salted and preserved human body parts, like they were making artisanal gourmet jerky, leaving the leftovers piling up in their cave for later. The whole thing was so huge that King James VI himself had to lead an army of 400 men to capture the Bean clan, who were executed summarily without trial. Too bad this entire cinematic plot is a glorious lie. There is not a single contemporary record mentioning Sawney Bean or his family, 0 reports of missing persons from the era, 0 court records of their execution, and 0 mention of this Hollywood epic manhunt led by the king. The first written account appeared in the 1700s, over a century after he supposedly lived. The real shocker? It was English propaganda, designed to convince Europe that the Scots were savage barbarians, because clearly nothing screams uncivilized like a cave full of inbred cannibals. The narrative worked so well that people still believe it today. There's even a tourist cave in Scotland that claims to be Sawney Bean's lair.
Number 4. William Tell. Imagine achieving such a level of fame that your country decides to put your face on everything: stamps, coins, tourist spots, you name it. That is William Tell's supposed life, except he never had one.
You know the plot. A skilled archer is forced by an evil governor to shoot an apple off his own son's head. The ultimatum? Miss, and both he and his son die. Tell, of course, hits the bullseye, splits the apple in half, and becomes a Swiss national hero. The kid, however, probably developed lifelong anxiety. The first mention of this story only appears about 200 years later than it supposedly took place. And here's the cynical part. The entire apple shot narrative was blatantly copied from an ancient Danish legend about a guy named Palnatoki. Same dramatic setup, same evil ruler, same apple on the kid's head. Furthermore, the evil governor in Tell's story, Gessler, there's no record of any governor by that name ever existing in that region. Although historians have known for centuries that William Tell is about as real as Santa Claus, Switzerland simply ignored them with enviable enthusiasm. They built statues of him, named streets after him, and just to be sure, even put his face on their money. The Swiss government became so absurdly defensive about Tell that when a historian in 1760 suggested the story might be false, they burned his book and forced him to apologize publicly. Talk about taking your fairy tale seriously. The branding is non-negotiable.
Number 3. Robin Hood. You know, the charitable guy who steals from the rich to generously give to the poor. Spoiler, turns out he most likely never existed. Imagine being so famous that people keep making movies about you centuries after you died, except you were technically never alive in the first place. That is Robin Hood for you, the most successful fictional influencer in medieval England. In medieval England, the name Rob Hood was basically slang for an outlaw. It was a common, generic name used for criminals who defied the law. The oldest stories about Robin Hood don't even paint him as a hero with scruples. He was more like that guy who posts inspirational quotes on social media but is actually just selling pyramid schemes. Basically, a scammer with a bow. The whole rich stealing, poor giving thing was conveniently added much later. The original Robin Hood stories were about a guy who just enjoyed stealing and hanging out with his bros in the forest. Think less noble outlaw and more medieval frat boy with a bow and arrow. Forest laws back then were incredibly harsh, and just walking through the wrong patch of trees could make you an outlaw. Imagine being banned from society because you took a shortcut through the wrong park. These laws were so ridiculous that people started inventing stories about outlaws who actually fought back. That's like someone today writing stories about a hero who fights parking tickets and actually wins. By the Tudor period, Robin Hood had undergone a complete and glorious PR overhaul. They transformed him from a rude, thieving forest criminal into a noble fighting for justice. That's like taking a story about a guy who steals cars and turning him into Batman.
Number 2. King Arthur. You probably think you know King Arthur. Brave king, magic sword, round table, the whole shebang. Relax, the chances of finding a unicorn in your backyard are seriously higher than finding actual evidence that Arthur existed. There is not a single document from the time Arthur supposedly lived that mentions him. Not one. And we are talking about a man who supposedly united all of Great Britain and fought invading armies. That's like no one bothering to write about World War II until the 90s, and then inventing that the leader rode a dragon. The first real mention of Arthur only appears 300 years after he supposedly died. Imagine if people in 2324 started writing about this amazing king of our time who pulled a sword out of a rock, and everyone said, yeah, that totally happened. Geoffrey of Monmouth, the guy who truly popularized Arthur's story, was basically the medieval equivalent of an unhinged fanfiction writer. This fellow wrote a history book in 1136 that has fewer facts than Twitter. It reads more like Game of Thrones than real history. He claimed that Arthur killed 960 men in a single battle, all by himself. That's not heroism, that is clearly video game cheating with serious hacking numbers. And Excalibur, that magic sword everyone knows? In the earliest stories, it wasn't even stuck in a rock. It was handed to Arthur by a mysterious lady of the lake. Yes, the legendary King Arthur accepted an anonymous weapon delivery. Honestly, that sounds more like a shadowy arms deal than a divine ceremony. The whole sword and the stone narrative was added later, probably for better marketing. We can't even find Camelot. You'd think someone would remember where they parked a massive castle full of knights and wizards, but apparently medieval GPS was weak. Every town in England with a hill and 2 stones has claimed to be Camelot at some point. Here's the thing about Arthur.
He may not have been real, but the hope he gave people was. And the good marketing was too.
Number 1. Mulan. Let's be clear. Mulan never existed. She is just a poem. The oldest mention of Mulan comes from a scroll called the Ballad of Mulan, from sometime between 386 and 581 AD. That's it. Just a ballad. No birth records, no military documents, not even an Employee of the Month award from the Imperial Army. The original poem is so vague, it doesn't even mention what part of China she was from, what her last name was, or when she lived. It's like writing a story about this guy, Bob, who did some cool stuff somewhere at some point. The perfect ghosting. In the original poem, no one, absolutely no one, realizes Mulan is a woman until after she returns home. She fights for 12 years, and not a single person notices. Either she was the greatest master of disguise the world has ever seen, or the ancient Chinese armies had very, very poor observation skills. It's less, I'll make a man out of you, and more, surprise dummies, I've been fooling all of you for over a decade. Over the centuries, writers couldn't stop themselves from meddling with the story, and they kept adding details. By the time we get to the 16th century, writers were adding things like foot binding to her tale, which is hilarious since that didn't even exist when the original poem was written. That's like someone writing a modern version of Romeo and Juliet where they break up because of Instagram drama. Even today, different versions of Mulan's story are used to promote different agendas. If you need a tale about filial piety, Mulan is your girl. If you want a feminist icon, Mulan delivers. If you are looking for a patriotic war hero, Mulan can do that too. She has basically become the Swiss Army knife of Chinese folklore. Just pull out the morality blade that suits you. That's all for today, folks. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to catch them.